Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn. Thanks again for joining me. Before we get into the topic of the day, as we've done in the last few weeks, let's talk a little bit about the El Mayo situation. Before I do that, I want to remind you of my newsletter. In the newsletter this week, which came out on Sunday, I have maybe 10 articles linked that deal with the El Mayo situation. So if you want someplace where you can get all this aggregated information, all these stories, all you have to do is click on a hyperlink and you go right to the story. Sign up for the newsletter. It doesn't cost a thing. I don't get anything out of it other than just the enjoyment of actually doing it. Just give me your email. You'll get it in your inbox every Sunday. And again, it's just a nice place where all the information is aggregated. Over the last week or so, lots of information continues to come out about the El Mayo situation. Here's some things that I found interesting over the last few days. Number one, looks like Joaquin either has or imminently will be indicted for treason. Again, that stems from his involvement in the abduction of El Mayo and the transportation of El Mayo from Mexico into the United States. And as we talked about previously, that statute, that law was rewritten after the Dr. Humberto Alvarez Machain case to address situations where Mexican citizens were assisting in the kidnapping or extradition, or however you want to describe it, of a Mexican citizen into another country, in this case, the United States, as opposed to people from the United States actually going in and abducting somebody like El Mayo or Dr. Alvarez. So that's number one. Number two, as more information comes out, it seems that this statement that was put out that allegedly was from El Mayo, and remember, we read it almost in full a couple weeks ago, that seems to have been pretty accurate. Not saying completely accurate, but it sure seems like that's a pretty good recitation of the story and the sequence of events. One of the things that came out just in the last day or so was some new evidence that really does suggest that, as El Mayo had alleged, Sinaloa Governor Roca Maya was at this little compound area where the meeting was supposed to be, that meeting that lured El Mayo there, lured El Mayo to the meeting without a large security entourage. And then from there, he was abducted by Joaquin and others. So that's kind of interesting, and we'll follow that a little bit more. The last thing I wanted to mention is, the internet's an amazing thing. Google Maps is an amazing thing. So in the last week or so, there have been numerous pictures and videos of this little compound, very nice area, by the way, where this meeting was to have occurred, where the abduction of El Mayo apparently started from. You can see various pictures and videos of it. You can get a GPS location. It's easy to pull up on Google Maps. And then there are some videos and pictures. So there's one in particular. There's a video of a white pickup truck leaving this compound, and allegedly that's the truck carrying El Mayo in the back. There are pictures and videos of the airstrip from which the plane departed on its way to the United States. There are even videos of a plane taking off that's alleged to be the plane that carried, in addition to the pilot, Joaquin and El Mayo. I haven't done a side-by-side comparison of that video and the pictures of the plane in Texas. But nevertheless, it appears that that was the plane. As I say, lots and lots of different information, lots of pictures, very interesting, and we'll keep following it for developments as the weeks go on. All right, this week I want to go back to the discussions we've had over the last few weeks, interrupted occasionally by the El Mayo situation. But remember what we've looked at recently. So we started off looking at the actual abduction of Agent Camarena outside the American consulate. We looked at alleged or statements from alleged participants, alleged witnesses, and through the course of analyzing that, we looked at known facts, we looked at statements, we tried to put things together. We called into question the testimony and the statements of some people who alleged to have participated in the abduction or otherwise having been involved in the abduction scenario. So that's number one. Number two, we looked at the conspiracy meetings, those alleged meetings where there was this planning to kidnap a DEA agent, to kidnap Agent Camarena, perhaps. I remember they may have known who the agent they were interested in was very early, or they may not have known until very late, right? A lot of it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense sequentially. And in that process, we also questioned the veracity of some alleged witnesses. And in particular, when you put those two together, we questioned the veracity of the statements made by two people in particular, Jorge Godoy and Rene Lopez Romero. Remember, they are critical because they were the primary, the key witnesses in the Zuno II trial. And moreover, particularly with respect to Mr. Zuno, but even in a grander scope, when you look at the conspiracy meetings that were alleged and things, the testimony of Lopez Romero and Godoy in Zuno II was significantly different than the case presented at Zuno I and significantly different than the case presented in the first criminal trial. Right? So, if we're looking at this sequence of events, we're looking at the testimony over 3 trials. We end up at the last trial, the Zuno II trial, with 2 witnesses who have now, just by looking at their testimony, some doubts about them. And I'm focusing on them not simply because they testified against Zuno, who was, our client, but because it says a lot about the prosecution, the government's case, both from an investigative, that is a DEA perspective, and you know who we're talking about, as well as from a U.S. government and a prosecution standpoint. So we get to Lopez Romero and Godoy, and we've talked about them before. And one of the easy common refrains is to say, you know what, these were bad guys in Mexico. They escaped from a bad situation in Mexico by saying they had information, they had connections to Garate Bustamante. They came up and now have lived in the United States for 30-something years, have received who knows how much money, and then they've gone on to make new, bolder, and more outlandish statements as time goes by. Remember, every few months, every year or so, something new comes out. So what I wanted to do today is talk about Godoy and Lopez Romero in 2 particular ways. Number one is I wanted to go through some of the information that we had gathered and has been gathered by others with respect to Godoy and Lopez Romero when they were in Mexico. So when we just categorically say they were bad folks, does anybody really know what that means? Well, let's talk about them in particular. So that's number one. And then number 2, we're going to go back and refresh everyone's recollection, and we'll do it in a fairly abbreviated way, but refresh everyone's recollection as to the amazing way, the amazing timing of certain recollections, certain statements made by Godoy and Lopez Romero to the DEA. So first, let's talk about these guys. One thing we can say for certain is that both Lopez and Godoy were corrupt officers with the Jalisco State Police well before they became bodyguards for the cartel, and particularly for Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. And remember, I hate the term cartel, but I use it with respect to this just for ease and convenience. So what do we know with respect to their time with Fonseca? Well, think about it. We can be fairly certain that they saw and maybe participated in incidents of torture, murder, unprovoked attacks on Americans. Both Godoy and Lopez, in separate incidences, were arrested, criminally charged. That's outside of their employment with Fonseca. Both of them committed perjury, solicited others to commit perjury, and a variety of things. So when we say they weren't good people in Mexico, that's an understatement. So let's look at Godoy for a minute. Godoy joined the Jalisco State Police in March 1979. In January 1981, he was transferred from Guadalajara to San Juan de los Lagos as a disciplinary measure because he had been caught drunk on duty. He resigned from the police force briefly under kind of dubious circumstances. He returned to duty in 1983. He admitted while he was on the stand in the Zuno trial that on one particular occasion in 1984, he and several other officers raided a ranch and seized large quantities of marijuana and cocaine. Rather than initiating a prosecution, though, the officers returned the drugs to the traffickers, for which Godoy received money. Godoy also admitted that in the middle of 1984, while still a police officer, he met Fonseca and began providing security to him using his credentials as a Jalisco State police officer. He admitted freely that he provided services to Fonseca on many occasions and that he was well paid by Fonseca in return. He testified that before too long, he became upset when his commander wanted a cut of the money which Fonseca was paying him, not wanting to share the profits. Godoy testified that he quit the police force and went to work full-time for Fonseca. At trial, he admitted that he knew that Fonseca was involved in the sale of drugs. He knew the violent side of the DEA, or of the drug trade, sorry. In DEA 6, he admitted that in June of 1984, he watched as Fonseca tortured a young American man by repeatedly burning him with a red-hot knife. For the next 3 weeks, that victim was chained in an underground storage room. Eventually, Godoy watched as the American was forced to stand next to an open grave with his hands tied behind his back. Although the victim was crying and begging not to be killed, Fonseca, in the presence of Godoy, shot the victim with a pistol repeatedly, and the victim's head was said to have been, quote, blown off before he fell to his grave. He alleged and admitted that he was at La Langosta in January of 1985 when Walker and Rattlat were killed. When the actual attack on Walker and Rattlat was going on, Godoy admitted that he heard them cry and beg for their lives for about 20 minutes before they were finally killed. There was an investigation done into Godoy's past, and he had come from the town of San Juan de los Lagos in the state of Jalisco. It was a small, quiet town, and he was born and raised there. If you look at the interviews with people there, he was not well respected, not well liked. He, at one point, had actually run a pizzeria for about 3 years. People felt that he was dishonest, that he lied all the time, and a townsman said he was not trusted by the town. He had a reputation for dishonesty when he was interviewed by various people. He, interestingly, this gets, I think, to the heart of who Godoy was. And remember that once Ernesto Fonseca was arrested in Puerto Vallarta, the gravy train was gone, right? There were a lot of people who made money, their livings off of Fonseca, and all of that was gone when Fonseca was arrested, and that included Godoy as well as Garate Bustamante. But here's something very interesting. July 23, 1991, a month or so before his first interview with the DEA, Godoy robbed a gas station in the town of San Diego Alejandra using an Uzi machine gun with the help of an accomplice named Benito Sebastian Ramirez. While both men were fleeing the scene in Godoy's car, the police stopped them and arrested them. When they were in custody, both Godoy and Sebastian admitted that they committed not only the charged robbery, but 3 others. Okay. Godoy then went through a whole process of covering up. He submitted false statements under oath and actually admitted to the police that, quote, my statement was false, end quote, close quote, or quote, I did it only to avoid having problems, close quote. He was imprisoned and sent to jail in Guadalajara, and in order to avoid conviction, he retained an attorney in Guadalajara named Jose Maria Contreras Ruan. Contreras said that he worked with Godoy and his family to manufacture an alibi for Godoy. Contreras said, and this is in a signed, sworn affidavit, Contreras said that without the fabrication, there was more than enough evidence to convict Godoy. According to Contreras, he submitted the false sworn affidavit of Godoy, in which Godoy claimed that he was framed by the police for robberies in retaliation for his not having provided them free beer and pizza in his restaurant. Contreras also submitted the sham affidavits of 4 witnesses, each of whom was either a good friend or relative of Godoy. etc., etc., etc. So let's go back for just a second. July 23, 1991. Remember, he testifies in 1992 at Zuno II. In August of 1991, Godoy first travels to California to meet with the DEA. And remember, he comes to the DEA through Garate Bustamante. So, what? 1 month, less than a month after he stages a robbery, admits to having been in 3 more of those. He admits in his affidavit that he had been put, or in the DEA 6 and then in his trial, Godoy says that he had been put in contact by the DA or with the DA by an unidentified person who told him that he would be paid and receive a work permit if he assisted in their investigation. He testified that he was fearful for his life if he remained in Mexico. In fact, he had said that 11 out of the 13 former members of Fonseca's crew who had been released from prison had been killed. Godoy also testified that he was afraid that he would be arrested again and taken to the United States to stand trial. Okay. Godoy, after his first meeting with the DEA in late 1991, returned to his hometown to try to make amends with his wife who had left him after his arrest. Godoy's brother-in-law said that Godoy returned with promises of good money and a comfortable life in the United States for his wife and children. These promises convinced Godoy's wife to return to him, and at least for a significant period of time, Godoy and his family were living together in Southern California. Okay. What about Rene Lopez Romero? Like Godoy, Lopez Romero was an officer in the Jalisco State Police. He was employed there from 1979 until 1984. At trial, he admitted that on at least one occasion he had accepted a bribe in exchange for having allowed a person from whom he had confiscated illegal weapons to go free. When asked whether he considered this a violation of his oath and his duty, Lopez said, "I wouldn't call it an oath because we didn't go through an oath when we were going to join the corporation," referring to the police force. In an interview and a sworn affidavit, Fernando Ponce Mares, Lopez's former partner, said that when he stopped a suspect, oftentimes, Lopez would let the person go free if he offered a significant bribe. He would also use his police credentials to steal from citizens. We can talk at length about the testimony of Lopez Romero and whether or not it was factually accurate. One of the things that is significant is that he claimed that in April of 1984, well, he was still a police officer, he and several other police officers were involved in a marijuana investigation in the town of Mascota when they stopped a truck containing about 2,000 kilos of the drug at a roadblock. Lopez claimed that the pickup truck driven by Ruben Zuno Arce, approached the officers, and that his commander, Flores Torres, talked to Zuno for a little bit and then ordered the officers to release Zuno, the truck, and the drugs. Flores gave a statement after the trial where he said that the incident categorically, absolutely did not occur. He said that, as a matter of fact, neither he nor Lopez would have been involved in any drug investigation because that type of criminal activity was within the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal authorities, and that he said that he had never, ever, ever set a roadblock up for any purpose in Muskota. And he also said that he had never brought in the local police to assist his own officers in Muskota. Okay. As was the case with Godoy, Lopez worked for Fonseca for a period of time, saying that he first met Fonseca in September of 1984. He acknowledged that in 1984, November 1984, he was involved in the capture and torture of a man and a woman who Fonseca's wife claimed was annoying her residents. Fonseca had the couple kidnapped, brutally tortured. Lopez claimed that he was disturbed by the torture. And in an effort to kind of show that he was compassionate, he testified, "I told the interrogator he would be better to shoot him instead of making him suffer so much." He also testified that he was present when the 4 Jehovah's Witnesses were tortured and murdered in December 1984. He admitted that he watched as all 4 of the people were lined up by the side of an open grave and killed. He also testified, whether true or not, that he actually was involved in the kidnapping of Agent Camarena himself. Various other allegations that are important, in totality. But then you go, as was the case with Godoy, that Lopez testifies that he came to the United States in January 1992. He said he was initially put in contact with the DEA by a friend who told him that the DEA agents could help me in my problem. In particular, he was worried about his personal involvement in the murder of Agent Camarena. In fact, he testified that, quote, Fonseca had ordered me murdered, close quote, and that, quote, a lot of people were being killed whom I knew had been involved in the murder of Enrique Camarena, close quote. When he began talking to the DEA, he said he was given immunity and regular payments of $3,000 per month. At the time of trial, remember, so this is, approximately 11 months later, he had been given more than $30,000, and that in exchange, he testifies this, in exchange for cooperating with the prosecution, he was granted immunity from prosecution despite his claim that he had actually participated in the abduction of Agent Camarena, whether true or not. So let's just go back for a second. I know that was a lot of information, so thanks for staying with me. But what do we have? We have 2 people who testify in Zuno II in a way that's materially inconsistent with Zuno I testimony and also with the first criminal trial. I'll call it the Verdugo trial. we have two people who were bad people, who had worked for Fonseca, who had violated their duties as police officers, who had participated in murder and torture, including of American citizens, who were then brought to the United States, given immunity, given money, given access to the United States for their family. And one of them had said, I participated in the abduction of Agent Camarena, and that is who the DEA investigators at the time decided to rest their case upon, and who the prosecution, Manny Medrano and John Carlton, decided were the witnesses they were going to put on to try to convict one person. Remember, when Zuno II takes place, you have two defendants, right? You have Dr. Humberto Alvarez Machain, and you have Ruben Zuno Arce. That's it, right? Dr. Alvarez is released at the end of the prosecution's case because the government didn't make a case. They didn't even make a case sufficient to go to the jury. So you have these guys testifying against Ruben Zuno Arce and nobody else. Think about that. Assume for the sake of argument that everything these guys said was true. Particularly assuming, just for this discussion, that Lopez Romero really was involved in the abduction of Agent Camarena. In order to convict one person, and all right, if you want to say it could have been two, but what are you doing? You're giving immunity, you're giving money, you're allowing them come to the United States, which is exactly what they wanted. Doing all of this to convict two people, and these are bad people. Now, I know the refrain from a lot of prosecutors, maybe some law enforcement folks, is, well, you know what? In order to convict bad people, you sometimes have to get cooperation from other bad people. Murders and rapists don't hang around with priests. Yeah, okay, I understand that. But you're saying, think about this, under the government's best case scenario, Ruben Zuno Arce had participated in some conspiracy meetings talking about finding and dealing with the DEA agent causing the problems, right? That's the best case scenario. And maybe, again, best case scenario, he had owned Lope de Vega and maybe knew that it was going to be used by Camarena, or that it was transferred to Camarena in a sham transaction. Best case scenario, right? He didn't, no claim that he abducted Camarena, no claim that he participated in the torture or interrogation of Agent Camarena, no claim that he ordered the abduction or had control over any of the people who were involved in the abduction, no claim that he gave the orders for Camarena to be tortured, no claim that he was involved in the actual death of Agent Camarena, no claim that he was involved in the cover-up and the disposal of the body, no claim that he had any involvement in the abduction and murder of Captain Zavala. None of that. So in order to prosecute that man, you're going to pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to somebody who said, I was involved in the actual kidnapping, to people who said, I was involved in the actual murder of American citizens. How does that make any sense to anybody? And what we don't know is how much money was spent, let's say from the beginning of the process, of the investigation till today. How much money was paid to Lopez Romero? How much money was paid to Godoy? How much money was paid to Ramon Lira, the third amigo in The Last Narc? How much money was paid to other witnesses or purported witnesses who never testified? How much money was paid to Garate Bustamante? None of that. So the idea that you have to use criminals to get to other criminals, I just don't buy it here. There has to be some proportionality, right? Somebody accused of being involved in a conspiracy somehow becomes substantially more important than somebody who was involved in the actual abduction of Agent Camarena, somebody who was actually involved in the or around at the time of the murders of Walker and Rattlehat, somebody actually involved in the murders of the missionaries. But it goes further. We've talked about this before, and I want to go through it again. It won't take very long. So, if you remember, Zuno I, Zuno is convicted. A new trial is ordered on March 27. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The new trial is ordered by Judge Rafiti. And in that new trial order, he said, we've talked about this before, that in closing arguments, Manny Medrano had made a claim with respect to Primavera Park in a way contrary to the way he had explained the evidence and the use of the evidence during the presentation of the case, and done so in a way that then prevented Zuno's defense team from rebuttal. Okay. So, new trial is ordered. Prosecution appeals. It goes to the Ninth Circuit. March 27, 1992, the government's appeal is denied by the Ninth Circuit. March 27, 1992. So at that point, what's happening? You have to do a new trial. Cervantes, as we've talked about over and over, Cervantes is out, right? There's no way he's going to be presented as a credible witness. So you got the government, knowing there's going to be a second trial, all of a sudden not having any witnesses. Well, conveniently, within a matter of days, Godoy and Lopez recalled that they had seen Zuno at these alleged conspiracy meetings. Here's what's interesting. In his first meeting with the DEA, he doesn't, he being Godoy, doesn't mention at all that Zuno was present at any of these alleged meetings. Okay. In fact, he doesn't mention Zuno at all in a negative way. I'll note that he did recognize Zuno in a photo lineup, okay? But he doesn't say that he's involved in these alleged conspiracy meetings until April 7, 1992. April 7, 1992. Remember, the Ninth Circuit's order, affirming Judge Rafiti's new trial order, March 27, 1992, And April 7, 1992, Godoy remembers that Zuno was at conspiracy meetings. Lopez Romero, on the other hand, or for his own part, did not discuss any alleged conspiracy meetings until his fourth meeting with the DEA. Okay, so he met with the DEA on March 5, April 9, April 14, and none of those times did he mention these alleged conspiracy meetings. But suddenly, on April 15, 1992, he all of a sudden remembers. 90 days in the United States, 3 meetings had gone by, and then in the 4th meeting, there you go. So think about it. Within days after the Ninth Circuit's affirmance of the new trial order, and within 8 days of one another, Godoy and Lopez implicate Zuno. That in and of itself is shocking, to say the least. But remember that they only did that, they only testified this way, is because he had received money, immunity, relocation of his family, housing, etc. It's also significant, if you think about it, because Godoy himself admitted and discussed the fact that he was brutally interrogated by Mexican officials about the Camarena kidnapping, and even signed a confession detailing his purported knowledge. Godoy's confession does not contain a single reference to Zuno, much less any evidence that he was at any conspiracy meetings. Hey, so you've got Godoy being interrogated by the police. The word brutal is used in the testimony itself. We all know from lots of different examples that the interrogation by Mexican police can lead to lots of false confessions. It can lead to false statements, but it also can get out a lot of information that's true and accurate. Why? Because of the brutality, right? Nevertheless, in this confession, doesn't mention Zuno at all. But remember, we talked about this last week, but he does say, hey, in this confession, I didn't work for Fonseca in November and December of 1984, but then he goes to trial and he testifies about conspiracy meetings in November and December of 1984. So again, I want to present this information not in the way of suggesting that it's all about Mr. Zuno. All right. I'm on record. Everybody knows I don't believe there was sufficient evidence to convict Mr. Zuno, frankly, in either trial. And I think that Manny Medrano's statement in the last arc that there's more than enough evidence to convict Mr. Zuno is false and hyperbole and not well taken. And I could use stronger language, but I won't. But I want to focus this on the prosecution. And that includes the DEA investigators working with the prosecutors. It includes the United States Assistant or the assistant United States attorneys prosecuting the case, you have two people who absolutely should never have been trusted. You have two people who participated in torture and murder of American citizens. You have one who admits to being involved in the Camarena abduction itself, whether that was true or not. And the government decided that they were the people they were going to hang their hats on and present at trial. And they were going to pay them money. They were going to give them a new life in the United States. They were going to do the one thing that they wanted most, which was get them out of Mexico and away from the people who were doing Fonseca's bidding. You know, so many people had already been killed. They wanted out of Mexico. So you have to ask yourself two questions. Number one, how diligently did the investigators look into the backgrounds of Godoy and Lopez before they decided that they were credible, right? Did they simply buy their statements, literally and figuratively? And two, what did the prosecution do to verify that these people were credible enough to put on the stand at trial? And I submit to you that the prosecution has a particular duty. Their duty is not simply to convict defendants. Their duty is to ensure that justice is done. And in this case in particular, I've argued strenuously, I'm arguing strenuously now, and I will say until my last breath that the prosecution failed to uphold its duty. Okay. That was kind of a three-part analysis of Godoy and Lopez and the case presented by the government. And again, I want people to think about what all went into getting these two witnesses. Because lots of other witnesses came through Garate. Remember, Garate had a damn newspaper ad saying, hey, if you know anything about the Camarena case, you can get money and go to the United States. How many people are living in the United States now because of presenting evidence to the DEA with respect to the case? How much money has been spent since in time? We don't know. Okay. I get a little wound up. We're going to continue to talk about the Camarena case in over the next couple of months leading up to some things that we have planned in early February. We'll talk about that later. Also going to put in a few episodes talking about current events. So we'll do kind of as we've been doing as current events come up, we will address those. Next week is Labor Day weekend. Hope everybody has a great holiday weekend. Everybody is safe. I can't believe that it's already going to be September. But I will not have an episode next week. So join me 2 weeks from now. We'll continue our discussions. For now, though, this has been Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. Thank you. Be well, everyone.